Welcome to Interfaith Voices, the independent show exploring the spiritual and religious diversity of today's world. I'm Maureen Fiedler. To find out more about us, visit our website at interfaithradio.org. You can listen to past shows, download our podcast, or sign up for our free weekly email bulletin. That's all at interfaithradio.org. When former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney announced his candidacy for president, some political eyebrows were raised over the question of a Mormon for president. Some evangelicals have even suggested that this disqualifies him. But what do Mormons believe? Is there any reason to think that Mormonism would disqualify someone from becoming president? On the phone to discuss this from Salt Lake City is Blake Ostler, a Mormon himself, an attorney, and the author of a 4-volume series entitled Exploring Mormon Thought. Welcome to Interfaith Voices, Mr. Ostler.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
First, let's deal with some popular images of Mormonism and how they might be affecting perceptions of Mitt Romney. The most obvious one is polygamy. What do contemporary Mormons believe about polygamy?
Well, I hesitate to speak for all Mormons, and I can tell you that my wife definitely would not like that. But some are horrified by that, some long for its return. But I think that most Mormons would say that polygamy was once sanctioned by God, but it's presently contrary to God's will. I would add that evangelicals must believe essentially the same thing because both Abraham and Moses were polygamous, and God even arranged plural wives for them.
And how about the official position of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City?
Polygamy is presently contrary to God's will, and anybody who practices it is excommunicated from the Mormon Church presently.
And so Warren Jeffs, he's been charged with running a polygamous sect, essentially, but he has no connection with the Mormon Church.
Absolutely none whatsoever.
Okay.
I would add, however, that I went to school with some of his children.
Did you really?
I did. And they were good people. I liked them.
While we're on issues of marriage and sexuality, what do Mormons teach about the hot-button issues, abortion and gay marriage?
Let me first deal with gay marriage. The position of the church, I think, is clear. Gays, lesbians are all children of our common Heavenly Father. They are worthy of love just as they are, and there's nothing evil with a homosexual orientation. However, the same standard applies to them as applies to heterosexuals. Sex outside of marriage is contrary to God's plan for us, and it's the same for both straights and gays, and it's not within the scope of God's plan that gays marry each other. If, for instance, homosexuals remained celibate, they would certainly be welcomed into the fold, and there's nothing wrong with having proclivities or tendencies, and they're worthy of love like the rest of us are.
So Mormons would not be into trying to, quote-unquote, cure someone of homosexuality?
Well, not the Mormon faith. Some Mormons may, and some non-Mormons may.
Okay. How about the issue of abortion?
On abortion, I believe the position of the church there is also clear. It's different than the Catholic position. Abortion is generally contrary to the inherent value of human life. However, there are exceptions for the physical and psychological well-being of the mother and family, and in cases of rape and incest. Further, it's the church's position that that decision is best made at the individual level in prayerful consultation with the local bishop. I would add that most Mormons on a political level are very against legal abortion, but I believe that the position of the church itself is probably broader than that political position.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, a Mormon would be free to do what, in fact, a lot of Catholic politicians do. In other words, say, well, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I think it would be acceptable if it remained legal.
There's no question that that would be the case. In fact, the church leadership has expressly stated that Mormon politicians are not bound by church policy positions, and that they are free to guide and pass legislation and so forth, given the dictates of their own conscience. It's clear that a Mormon could believe that abortion, as my personal position is, I personally believe that abortion is immoral in almost all circumstances, but I believe the decision is best made by the individuals in prayerful consultation with their local ecclesiastical leaders.
Mm-hmm. So you would not favor putting it into law, but you would counsel someone at an individual level to avoid it.
Partial birth abortions, I believe, are proper to regulate and even legislate against. And at some point, the interest of the fetus will become so great that we ought to give great weight to the value of human life. And so the sliding scale that's been established by the Supreme Court is probably a very rational way of approaching that issue.
But for the sake of this discussion, therefore, a Mormon is not bound to implement into law the moral teachings of his or her church.
Definitely not. In fact, as I said, the church has an official stance that Mormon politicians are not bound by policy decisions of the church.
Now, what's the current stance of the Mormon church in regard to the equality of women? Because it's well known that the Mormon church opposed rather vigorously the Equal Rights Amendment when it was up for ratification.
That's true. My own view, which is all I have, is that the Mormon church would indicate that women are equal with men. That doesn't mean that they're the same in all respects as men. The Mormon church has a very broad women's organization. It's Relief Society. In fact, my wife is the Relief Society president in our local ward, which is like a parish.
But women can't become Mormon bishops or become part of the Council of the 12 or something like that.
No, that's true. Women don't hold the priesthood. It would be like the Catholic faith in that respect. But it's certainly the position that women are equal. Holding different positions doesn't mean that we aren't equal. I think it's rather clear that
I think that's called complementarity and not equality, though. From a woman's perspective, I think that's sort of equality with some amendments, shall we say.
Well, that may be. I mean, I think there'd be a lot of different views on that, and all I have is my own. And, of course, that's open to interpretation, but the church is all about a robust family life with emphasis put on the value of parenting and nurturing children. And anything that's going to detract from that central value is going to be opposed by the church.
What does the Mormon church teach, if anything, about separation of church and state?
They are separate realms. The church teaches that the Constitution is an inspired document. It's clear that the church's position would be that no one can be subjected to another's faith, and the government must remain neutral, that the government can neither foster nor promote a particular religion, and neither can it legislate against a religion.
So, therefore, a Mormon president would not be seeking to establish some kind of a Mormon theocracy. I'm trying to deal with some of the potential images some people might have out there.
The very notion is preposterous.
Now, some evangelicals have suggested that Mormons are not Christian, but the very name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Do Mormons regard themselves as Christian?
Emphatically, yes. Mormons regard Christ as their Savior, that through His atonement He made them free. He saved them and opened the doors to exaltation. And I would add that the usual meaning of the word Christian is somebody who accepts Jesus as significant for their religious beliefs in some sense. Mormons go well beyond that. They have a very high Christology.
Do Mormons regard Christ as God?
Absolutely. Christ is God. Now, you've got to be careful because Mormons believe in three persons in the Godhead, like regular Christians do.
Mm-hmm. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
So we would want to make some distinctions. Christ is God, but He's not the whole of God. There's more to God than just Christ.
But Mormons do have some differences from Catholics and Protestants when it comes to theological beliefs. What do you see as the major differences that Mormons would have with the rest of Christianity?
Well, the major difference from a theological perspective would be its rejection of the notion of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. Mormons believe that there is a part of every human that is eternal, that was uncreated, and that we all lived in a premortal existence with our Heavenly Father as His children. These are beliefs that I believe, are fairly unique to Mormonism, that are not shared by other Christians, and they have far-reaching consequences.
Now, Mormons also accept both the Old and New Testaments, if I'm not mistaken, but they
Correct.
also regard the Book of Mormon as sacred. Briefly, can you say what the Book of Mormon is, and does it change anything fundamental in Christian belief?
The Book of Mormon proclaims to be a revealed testimony of Christ of some who lived in ancient America from about 600 BC to AD 425. But even that would be an oversimplification. Does it change anything? In terms of what it says, it doesn't. In terms of the fact that it's here, it does. The Book of Mormon couldn't possibly be what it claims to be unless Joseph Smith were somehow precisely what he claimed to be.
But what do you mean by that?
If the Book of Mormon is in fact an ancient record in some sense, if it's truly the record of an ancient people, the only way that that could be true is if Joseph Smith had some revelation that would have delivered that information to him.
All right, now what ancient people is that the record of?
There are actually 3 migrations who came from the Old World to the New World and also received revelation, also had a record to write.
And who were those people?
Well, there are various. Some were called the Jaredites who came, and we don't know when they came. It would have been very anciently, and they probably came through Asia. There's another group that came through the Israelites, and then another group after that out of the Israelites. But a very small group of people, I would imagine, that were Israelite.
Do Mormons believe that strains of those people still exist in North America?
Certainly they may still exist, and it's very likely that their DNA, their blood, their covenant promises would be interspersed throughout peoples of the Americas. But there's no commitment among Mormons or in the Book of Mormon itself, in my view, that it purports to be the record of all of the ancient Americans. And certainly itself would tend to indicate that we may find, for instance, Asiatic DNA among the DNA of ancient Americans.
Now, would these peoples who came from the Old World have brought with them the revelation of Christ? Is that what Mormons believe?
Well, in some sense, actually, the revelations came while they were here in large part. But yes, Jesus Christ is eternally God, and the revelations, I would say, in the Book of Mormon clarify some points and clarify that the prophecies of Christ were given before he was born and that they were clearly understood by some of his prophets.
What would you say to someone who says when Europeans came here and encountered Native Americans, they didn't encounter groups that claimed a belief in Christ?
I would say certainly if they looked a little further, they'd find that in fact the reason the Amerindians were so willing to accept them is that they believed that there would be a white God who returned. And that little bit of looking would indicate that there are at least similarities that are suggestive.
Now, for a Mormon, what takes precedence? The Bible or the Book of Mormon? Or isn't there an order?
Well, I don't believe that there is an order. Certainly Mormons are aware that the biblical records have been delivered after editing, and not all of the records have survived, and to the extent that we have various manuscripts, they may differ in some respects. That's not true with the Book of Mormon that's delivered as a revelation to Joseph Smith, but certainly Mormons believe that the biblical records were superintended by the Spirit of God and that God took special care to preserve them.
After a short break, we'll be back for more conversation with Blake Ostler about Mormon beliefs on a variety of issues. Interfaith Voices is supported in part by Sojourners Magazine, a monthly periodical covering Christian perspectives on peace and social justice. To read Sojourners online, visit sojo.net. That's SOJO.net. Sojourners Magazine, at the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. And now we continue our conversation with Mormon scholar Blake Ostler, author of the 4-volume work Exploring Mormon Thought. Now, David Hill, who is a columnist for a publication called The Hill, and it's a newspaper that covers Congress and the political world, recently said that Romney's been getting a pass on his religion for now, but it won't last once the public discovers certain Mormon practices. And I'd like you to deal with these. One is baptizing the dead. What's that tradition in Mormonism?
Well, it arises out of a statement in 1 Corinthians 15 and 29 that talks about baptism for the dead. Baptism for the dead for Mormons expresses our recognition that Christ commanded all to be baptized as a condition, essentially, of accepting Him and accepting His name. It's a recognition that our salvation is not done individually, that it is a joint endeavor. It's a recognition that our salvation is linked to those who went before us and who will come after us, and that we're saved, if we're saved at all, because we exist in eternal relationships that we value more than anything else that we know. Soren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, wrote, and a number of philosophers have written, it's very difficult to express pure love because anytime we give a gift, it creates an obligation to give a gift in return and therefore isn't really a gift. In order to express pure love, it's necessary to be able to give something without expectation of return. And Kierkegaard himself pointed out that work for the dead may be the best expression of pure love. And so baptism for the dead represents for Latter-day Saints a way of offering what they value most without an expectation of praise, without an expectation of immediate return, but simply out of the love that we have for all humankind and the recognition that if one person isn't saved, we're all diminished, and that our salvation is all humankind together.
And so the premise here is that baptism is necessary for salvation, and if people who came before you and have died have not been baptized, it's an act of love bringing them into the fold. Is that how you understand it?
I'd say that's true, except that young children who die are not baptized. They're automatically saved, as it were, by the atonement of Christ. It's a recognition that in order to accept Christ, we must be willing to enter into a covenant of love with Him and a covenant to serve others. Mm-hmm. And baptism represents that covenant.
Now, another item that David Hill mentions is that Native Americans descended from ancient Israelites. Now, to some extent, we've dealt with that. Is there anything else you'd want to say about that?
Well, there are some who would like to foist upon Latter-day Saints the view that we must accept that all Indians, all Amerindians, are descendants of Israelites. That's not true in my view. All that a Latter-day Saint needs to affirm is that there were ancient Israelites in America who wrote records, and that some of their descendants are still among us. That's all that's required.
Mm-hmm. Where are those records?
Well, they're translated in the Book of Mormon.
But did they leave some kind of record in stone, on parchment, something like that here in North America?
Yeah, the records were inscribed on gold plates or plates of metal, and that's what Joseph Smith had. He showed those gold plates to 11 other people who saw them and gave affidavits and testimony that they in fact saw them, felt them, handled them.
And where are they today?
Joseph Smith indicated that he delivered them back to the angel.
Another teaching that David Hill mentions is that men can become gods?
Well, Latter-day Saints accept the teaching of 2 Peter 1 and 4, which states that we participate in the divine nature. Probably to get a better feel for that position, I would recommend a website, MormonMiscellaneous.com, which gives the biblical background for that belief. It's not an unusual belief. Eastern Orthodox have a strong doctrine of theosis or human deification. The Roman Catholic Church has recently in its catechism added a section about human deification and participation in the divine nature. There's been somewhat of a less strain of that belief in Protestantism, but I would emphasize that there are articles that affirm that John Calvin taught a notion of deification. It's not a strange belief at all. It's simply the notion that as the Father and the Son are one, the disciples can also be one just as they are. And in that relationship, the glory that the Father and the Son possess and share, and that Christ had with the Father before the world was, can be shared with the disciples. And Mormons believe that John 17 teaches precisely that.
And finally, the last thing David Hill mentions is that the New Jerusalem will be in North America.
Actually, there's an old Jerusalem that will be where Jerusalem is, but there will be a new center created in America to receive Christ also when he comes.
In a few minutes, we'll return with more on Mormonism from scholar Blake Ostler. If you get only the first half hour of this show and want to hear the remainder, go to interfaithradio.org, where you can listen online or download our podcast. Once again, that's interfaithradio.org. Or you can send us feedback at P.O. Box 5031, Hyattsville, Maryland 20782. Stay with us. And now it's time for Celebrating Faith, a brief look at recent and upcoming feast days in various traditions. This week we have two, both Christian feasts. Sunday, June 3rd is Trinity Sunday, which celebrates the Christian doctrine of three persons in one God, the Creator, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. For Orthodox Christians, June 3rd is also All Saints' Day, a time to honor all saints, known and unknown, in the history of Christianity. Western Christian churches celebrate All Saints' Day on November 1st. Next week, you'll hear the incredible story of Daja Meston, a young American whose hippie parents left him at a Buddhist monastery in Nepal, where he was ordained a monk at age 6. Later ejected from the monastery, he joined the Free Tibet movement and eventually forgave his mother. It's all in a new book, Comes the Peace, My Journey to Forgiveness. Plan to join us next week when Daja Meston tells his own story. I'm Maureen Fiedler. Coming up, more from Mormon scholar Blake Ostler, the new sanctuary movement for immigrants, and a Catholic bishop taking on the Vatican. Stay tuned. And now we conclude our conversation with Blake Ostler, a respected Mormon scholar and author of a 4-volume series, Exploring Mormon Thought. On another note, do any of these beliefs that we've just been through, baptizing the dead, Native Americans descended from Israelites, men can becoming gods, do they have anything to do, in your estimation, as someone who knows Mormonism well, with being a political office holder?
I can't see why it would have anything to do with that at all, to be honest with you. Mormons are no more and no less qualified for political office than any other view. I don't know why Mr. Romney's religion is analyzed when it's irrelevant for everyone else. For example, when is the last time somebody asked Hillary Clinton a question about her religion? When's the last time that Joseph Lieberman got a question about his religion? Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to understand why evangelicals would be more willing to simply accept, for instance, a wonderful man, Senator Lieberman, and simply say his religion is fine, even though he's Jewish.
Let me say he did have a few questions about his religion because he's an Orthodox Jew, but it had more to do with practice and whether he would be available for a national crisis on the Sabbath.
And that may be a legitimate question, but it doesn't go to questioning his qualification to hold office. Right. You know, he's not automatically ruled out of the class of contenders because he holds certain beliefs.
Wouldn't it be true at another level that all religions, when looked at from the point of view of outsiders, have some beliefs that sound unusual or strange?
Well, reading, for instance, in the patristic fathers and what non-Christians were writing about them, the strangest belief in the entire world is to believe that a man could die and be dead for 3 days and rise again. That's really strange. They were demonized because it was said that they ate and drank the blood of an individual, when in reality they simply misunderstood the symbolism of the Eucharist. Of course, these beliefs can be caricatured and they can seem strange or weird. But for anybody who accepts the resurrection of Jesus Christ, anything that Mormons believe would be way distant second in terms of strangeness, I think.
Then we have recent polling from the Gallup organization that says that 24% of Americans say they would not vote for a Mormon for president. Now, as a Mormon yourself, in the light of all this, what would you say to such people? Do they have anything to fear?
Well, I have faith in the American people, to be fair. But it hurts to think that professed believers in Christ would engage in such judgments. Judging a person solely because they belong to a particular religion and excluding them on that basis alone is the essence of prejudice and bigotry. If Mr. Romney's views accord with your views regarding governmental policy, if he shares values about social issues such as gay marriage and abortion, then that's relevant. But the fact that he may believe, for instance, that Joseph Smith was a prophet, I don't see how that is relevant. Unless someone were to take the position that believing Joseph Smith is a prophet is just so absolutely weird that only a person of deficient intellect could actually believe that. If that were the case, I could see the argument. But that's certainly not the case. Mr. Romney's a fine individual, a very intelligent individual. Those kinds of judgments are hurtful, I believe, to Latter-day Saints. And I would add, that kind of prejudice is alienating to Mormons. I believe that if that kind of prejudice is in fact widely spread and it plays out, that Mormons will find themselves largely alienated from their religious right, and they will dissociate themselves.
We've been talking to Blake Ostler, who is a Mormon himself and an attorney in Salt Lake City, and the author of a 4-volume series entitled Exploring Mormon Thought. Thank you so much for being with us today, Blake.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I very much enjoyed it.
Some of us, who are old enough, remember the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. During that decade, Central America was plagued by dictatorships, many supported by the United States, by rampant human rights abuses, and by wars partly fueled by U.S. funding and armaments. As a result, people from countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua came north, seeking safety. They entered the United States illegally, but some religious people here offered them a safe haven in houses of worship or other places, often owned by religious institutions. Thus, they created a public sanctuary movement, opposing U.S. intervention in Central America with the public sheltering of refugees. In so doing, they hearkened back to the concept of sanctuary that dates from the Middle Ages, when a church, quote-unquote, sanctuary was considered a safe refuge from civil authorities. Today, there is a new sanctuary movement developing in the wake of the intense immigration debate. And here to talk about this with us is Rabbi Michael Feinberg, the executive director of the Greater New York Labor Religion Coalition. And he joins us by phone from New York. Welcome to Interfaith Voices, Rabbi Feinberg.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you all.
Rabbi Feinberg, what is the contemporary sanctuary movement? What's it attempting to do?
Well, it's attempting to do two things, and I should mention that I was active in the sanctuary movement in the 80s. And this is very much a link to that, but different in some significant ways. So like the movement in the 80s, we're trying to offer real, that is tangible support to real families, to offer them aid, to offer them legal support, material support, spiritual support.
And housing?
In housing, really depending on the circumstance, what people materially need, as well as support for their immigration status. So that's the one piece. The other piece, and this is similar to the 80s movement, we're also trying to change government policy. We really are quite conscious that until a very broken and unjust immigration system in this country is repaired, this humanitarian crisis will persist.
All right, and I want to come to that policy change in a minute. But you happen to be a rabbi, but this sanctuary movement is not limited to people of the Jewish tradition, is it?
No, not at all. I would say one of the great strengths of this movement is its diversity, both religious and ethnic. We have here in New York and across the country Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim participants. I believe people from other faith traditions are involved as well. And we have across the spectrum of ethnic communities, Latino, African American, Asian American, really everyone. It really represents the diversity of who's in America today.
Now, what's the basis for doing this in religious teaching? In your case, the Torah?
Well, I would say out of my own tradition, Judaism, the Hebrew Bible and all subsequent rabbinic teaching and law is very concerned with protecting the rights and the welfare of those people deemed to be the most vulnerable in society. In the language of the Hebrew Bible, that's the widow, the orphan, the stranger. And in contemporary terms, the stranger are the immigrants, the immigrant workers, undocumented immigrants. They really are vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, attack, marginalization, and it's out of this tradition that the sanctuary movement as a Jew grows for me.
Now, as we both know, sheltering undocumented immigrants is highly controversial, and a lot of people might say something like this to you. Hey, these folks are here illegally. You don't have a religious pass to break the law and protect them. How do you respond?
Well, first, I would point out that not all of the people who are being taken into this sanctuary movement are undocumented. We have here in New York one family, the husband, Haitian-born, is actually a green card holder, but still facing deportation.
Let me stop you. Why is he facing deportation?
For a past criminal record, he served time, he did his time, he's since working, he has a family, he owns a business. We feel he's fully reformed himself and should be given a second chance.
That was in the United States?
Yes, and not put onto an automatic deportation track because of a past mistake.
What about people who are undocumented? What would you say?
Well, I'd say a few things about that. One, there are over 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. There's just no realistic way, even if we desire to remove them from this country. They're here, they have families, they contribute to the economy, to the cultural vitality of this country. They're here to stay. We have to address that situation squarely and fix it. And frankly, I would also say to the people who complain about so-called illegal immigrants, I'd want to know from them who grows your food, who builds your homes, who performs all of the services you depend on every day. Frankly, it's the same population of immigrants. So I think there's some element of hypocrisy when we raise a complaint about the presence of these immigrants in our society.
Well, one of the things I find intriguing is that you represent a labor-religion coalition, and you were just talking about work. And a lot of the people who are opponents of illegal immigration say that these folks take jobs away from American workers and that they cost money in health care and education when they use public facilities in some states. How do you respond to that objection?
Well, there are a few ways to respond. One, in fact, they pay into services and things like Social Security in numbers vastly greater than what they take out. I forget the figure, but it's a staggering one of billions of dollars paid in from people who will probably never take out from these benefits because of their undocumented status. The other piece is that the labor movement in America recognizes with our transformation from a society where we're producing goods to a society based on services, that economy has radically changed to one that's immigrant-driven and women-driven and people of color-driven. So the labor movement rightly knows that its future is with immigrant workers. Those are the numbers that are growing in the labor movement. And as the jobs have been shipped overseas, these are the workers in America. They're taking jobs that otherwise haven't been taken by native-born American workers.
So the labor movement as a movement is not out there as part of this anti-immigration push that we're hearing so much about?
Not at all. The labor movement is one of the most powerful institutional advocates for comprehensive immigration reform that embraces immigrant rights and worker rights.
And how large is this sanctuary movement currently? How many immigrants are actually, like, being sheltered and so forth? Do you know?
We're in about 20 cities. I'm not sure of the total number being, at this point, sheltered. It's probably in excess of 50 or 60. But this is really just the beginning stages. We fully expect to expand this, to grow both in number of congregations and number of families being taken into sanctuary.
Have you had any vocal opposition or threats of prosecution for this?
Well, there have been representatives from the immigration services who've said that to do this is a violation of the law and anyone who does will be prosecuted. And of course the usual anti-immigration ideologues have come out swinging against this. But on the whole, I think people see the justice and the fairness of this. We're not asking anything unreasonable. We're asking for the kind of family values that we supposedly do stand for as a society, to keep families together, to prevent family members from being deported.
Are there families being split with the current deportation actions of the government?
It's a tidal wave of deportation splitting families in this country. More than 1.5 million people have been deported in the last 10 years, and most of those are people with families. Many of them have American-born children, so it's a case of the children staying and the family members being forced to leave, or the children being uprooted as well.
So in a sense, you could call this a pro-family movement.
Absolutely.
Now, when you hear the shrill in the immigration debate today, and you hear cries of no amnesty, or some people want laws that would make it illegal to rent to anyone who is not documented, or you hear cries for a wall on the border, what do you think of when you hear that?
I think of a sad and deplorable side of American history, in fact, that has always targeted immigrants, usually in times of economic or political insecurity. They're a very handy, easy target. In fact, they're never the source of the problems. The problems have to do with something much more profound about the American economy, who benefits from it, who doesn't, including the American middle class, and American trade policy. You really have to start to unpack all of that to look at the real problems that are causing this mass migration of people.
And what are the real problems causing this migration?
Well, one of the real problems is that the unfair nature of U.S. trade has basically made it impossible for millions of people to subsist decently in their own home countries. They've been uprooted as economic migrants, coming here just to survive, literally. And if there were a fair and just economic order, maybe millions of people could stay in their home countries and have a decent life there and not be pushed to come to the United States.
What do you say to people who object and say, well, why don't they come legally instead of illegally?
I would ask them if they were pushed to the limits of survival for themselves and their families, what measures they would or wouldn't take to survive.
Is it possible for a lot of these folks to actually come legally?
No, not with the current system. Impossible.
Now, what do you personally favor when it comes to immigration legislation? What would you like to see?
Well, I think the consensus of advocates is around some principles rather than a specific piece of legislation. And the principles are a fair and reasonable path to legalization for the millions of undocumented immigrants who are already living here, a path to citizenship, protection of immigrant workers' rights as workers, certainly excluding something like a guest worker program, which in the past has been little more than indentured servitude. Those are some of the basic principles along, of course, as we've been talking about, family unity, preserving families intact, not tearing them apart, an end to these mass raids and deportations.
What about enforcing the border?
I really don't think ultimately that's going to be the solution. The solution, again, is going to be in a fair, comprehensive immigration reform and starting to look at some of our trade and economic policies. Policing or militarizing the border hasn't worked, and I think it has very little chance of working in the future.
So it has to do with changing basically the economics, particularly probably in Mexico, where a good percentage of these folks come from.
Absolutely, though I do want to stress that this is not, as it's sometimes perceived or misperceived to be, a Mexican issue or a Latino issue. Mm-hmm. Immigration in this country is incredibly diverse. The picture is different than the stereotype might have it.
One thing that struck me as a host of a show on religion is that the issue of immigration tends to bring religious groups of all sorts together on the same side, behind a lot of the same principles that you've articulated. You've got otherwise conservative evangelicals, you've got Catholics, bishops like Cardinal Mahoney of Los Angeles, for example, mainline Protestants, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, just about everyone in the official religious community wants comprehensive immigration reform. Why is there that unity, do you think, at least in the official religious community?
Because I think it is such a profound principle in all of our traditions, loving your neighbor, loving the stranger in your midst, standing for justice, for dignity. That's a profound strain in all of our traditions, and I think the immigration issue brings us all together on that.
But in the midst of this religious unity, why has this not affected what are obviously millions of people who are vehemently anti-immigrant? The message about welcoming the stranger and the alien is not preached very often, perhaps?
Well, I do think as religious leaders and religious communities, we have to be much more vocal about our principles and how they extend to advocating for immigrant rights. But I do think that if you look at some of the polling, the majority of the American people are already on board with supporting a fair and reasonable path to legalization for the immigrants living in this country. I think that's already a majority position. It might be the case that some of the anti-immigrant advocates are louder and more shrill than the rest, but I don't think that means they have the numbers.
And where do you see this new sanctuary movement going? Is it likely to be prosecuted on the one hand, or is it going to expand a lot?
Well, we're not looking for confrontations with the government. That really is not our purpose. We hope we can offer support in whatever form is needed to these families that we're able to take in. And we hope that our voice as a religious community will be added to the public debate about a comprehensive immigration reform in this country.
And if people wanted more information on this movement, is there a website they could visit?
Yes, it's newsanctuarymovement.org.
That's newsanctuarymovement.org.
Yes, and there you'll find all the local contacts, the background, the up-to-date actions. That's a good way to get plugged in.
Rabbi Michael Feinberg is the executive director of the Greater New York Labor Religion Coalition, and he is one of the leaders in the New Sanctuary movement in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
it. Still to come, what led a Catholic bishop to take on the Vatican? Stay with us. Partial support for Interfaith Voices comes from the Loretto community, a religious community of sisters and co-members acting for peace and working for justice. On the web at www.lorettocommunity.org. That's lorettocommunity.org. The Loretto community, people of faith who are agents of change. When the Vatican speaks, Catholic bishops usually join the chorus, but not this time. John Parman has more.
In a rare show of defiance to the Vatican, a Catholic bishop is organizing a grassroots effort to reject the Vatican's new English translation of the Mass. Donald Troutman, Bishop of Erie, Pennsylvania, is leading the effort to stop changes to the Mass that he worries may lead to liturgical disorientation. For example, when the priest offers the blessing, "The Lord be with you," the new translation calls for the congregation to respond, "and also with your spirit," instead of the familiar, "and also with you." Joining us to learn more about these changes and the effort to oppose them is Daniel Burke, reporter for Religion News Service. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi.
This new translation from Rome was supposed to put the Catholic Mass in line with the original Latin text. What do most bishops think of the translation?
Well, when it originally came over in 2005, I believe, there was some consternation on their part. According to a poll in 2005, 47% thought the translations were fair or poor. They thought it had clunky, kind of archaic language. But the bishops did actually subsequently vote to accept the changes with about 60 amendments, which they sent to the Vatican, and that is awaiting approval right now.
And the person who's leading the charge to reject the changes is Bishop Donald Troutman. Now, who is Donald Troutman?
He's the Bishop of Erie, Pennsylvania, and he is also chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on the Liturgy. He's a well-known and respected liturgist in the church.
How long has he led this effort to reject these changes? Has it gone back all the way to when the translation was introduced in the United States?
It goes back even further than that. When the 2001 papal document from the Vatican was approved by the Pope but not written by him, that kind of set in motion the whole process. He criticized it as micromanagement from Rome. He thought that the local bishops should have a little bit more control over the language that people used in the pews. So he's been critical since at least 2001, and with increasing kind of fiery language he's used to denounce particular parts of the translation which he thinks are basically hard to say, that people in the pews are not going to remember, they're not going to proclaim as loudly as they should if they were active in the Mass.
Something that obviously will take place is parishioners will have to relearn many of the responses to the Mass. Is he worried that people may not be able to take the time or may not want to take the time to learn this new translation?
I think that is a fear. They're talking about handing out these laminated cards that would help people get through it. But this is a time when the U.S. Catholic Church, and particularly the bishops, don't want to invite any criticism. The people in the pews are their allies, the people who stayed with them through the sex abuse scandal and whatnot. And they really don't want to make any waves with those people. And people fear that that might actually happen, that people would question why the translations and why now.
And so now Bishop Troutman is starting a grassroots effort to galvanize people to reject these changes. How has he gone on that battle?
Well, he's given a number of speeches to liturgists, as well as writing in American and British publications. These English translations would be in effect for all English-speaking countries. So what happens in England and Australia and Ireland affects what happens in the U.S. as well. So he's been writing in all these publications trying to get people to pay attention, that these changes are coming, they're a train coming down the track, and people need to know this, and they need to talk to their bishops and their parish priests about them.
When you think of the percentage of bishops who still see this as fair or poor translation, who is in Bishop Troutman's court?
There are a number of U.S. bishops who are in his court, but they're not speaking out as loudly as he is. One priest told me that he's kind of the most outspoken on this, maybe not out on a limb, but certainly putting his concern for the church ahead of his own particular career. And so he's really the only guy speaking out on this right now.
And Bishop Troutman has called a lot of these changes unacceptable. What exactly is unacceptable?
It's the use of words like consubstantiation, these Latinate terms that ordinary Joe and Mary Catholic may not know how to translate, may not be able to wrap their mind around, rather than, for instance, its translation, one in being with. Jesus would be one in being with the Father rather than consubstantial with the Father. It's those kinds of things, introducing those complex theological terms that he thinks are unnecessary and maybe confusing to Catholics and may kind of turn them off.
Now, it's so interesting that there is this new difficult language. This Mass has been around for almost 40 years. Why suddenly is there this need for a new translation?
Well, this has been cranking around the Vatican for a while. The idea was that John Paul II, when he was celebrating Masses in different countries, came to appreciate that there were differences between the liturgy in these different countries. And one of the things the Church prides itself on is the Mass is the Mass is the Mass. And he wanted everyone to kind of be reading from the same page, or same missal at least. And so there was this movement begun in 2001, maybe even before, to newly translate the original Latin of the Mass and to get everyone reading from the same page.
And obviously these translations are happening in Rome. Who is leading the effort to make these translations?
It's called the International Committee on English in the Liturgy, which is a Vatican-appointed council of about half a dozen bishops from English-speaking countries. Although the Vatican does have the final say, the Congregation for Divine Worship has been very active in promoting the new translations and making sure that all the English-speaking bishops are on board with them.
And certainly because the Vatican is very Catholic, but also very multicultural, it may not be native English speakers who are making the final says in this translation.
That's right, that's correct. There may be a few cardinals whose English is not their first language are making sure that the Latin is translated the way they want it to be.
Now, who benefits from a new Mass? Will it just be the Pope when he comes here for a visit?
I think anyone who's kind of interested in the monolithic nature of the Church, anyone who wants to see the Church being one body and one Mass and one people will be happy with this. People who want to see the Church more of a grassroots, kind of spontaneous being or organization would be unhappy.
Now, last year, Pope Benedict XVI tentatively approved the use of the Latin Mass with the approval of bishops. Is it the case, possibly, that bishops would allow priests to go back to the old English translation if this new translation were approved?
It's hard to say. I think the Vatican is really being clear on this. They want everyone to use the new translation. Cardinal Francis Arinze, who heads the Congregation for Divine Worship, basically told the U.S. bishops a year ago in a strongly worded letter that they have to get on board with these changes, that it's not acceptable for them to reject them.
Daniel, where can people go to find out more about these changes?
Well, they can check out the website of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is usccb.org, or they can talk to their local parish priest or bishop.
Daniel Burke is a reporter for Religion News Service. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
For Interfaith Voices, I'm John Parman.
You've been listening to the sound of Interfaith Voices. We welcome your comments, feedback, suggestions, ideas, and prayers. For audio online or our podcasts of the show, visit interfaithradio.org. If you want our free weekly email bulletin or want to offer a comment on the show, contact us at interfaithradio.org or at Box 5031, Hyattsville, Maryland, 20782. Interfaith Voices is produced by the nonprofit Faith Matters of Brentwood, Maryland. Our producer and news director is John Parman, our assistant producer is David Castro, and our engineer is Margot Kelly. Original music by Mark Stenson. Join us next week to hear more Interfaith Voices. I'm Maureen Fiedler. Can children ever forgive parents who abandon them at a young age? I'm Maureen Fiedler, host of Interfaith Voices. Join me next time when we hear the incredible story of Buddhist author Daja Meston, a man who forgave his mother, who left him at a Buddhist monastery in Nepal before he was age 5. That's Interfaith Voices.